The dull thud of hammers echoed like the heartbeat of a colossal wooden creature. In the Chatham shipyard, the air smelled of sap, sweat, and ambition. It was the year 1759, and Great Britain, deep in the 7 Years' War, stood at a decisive moment. To control the seas was to control the world. In this atmosphere of imperial urgency, the idea emerged for a ship that would be far more than just another vessel. It would become a symbol, a promise, and, though no one knew it yet, a legend. The strongest timber from entire forests was selected with almost religious rigor. Centuries-old oak trees, giants that had stood for more than 300 years of storms, were sacrificed to give life to a hull that would need to withstand unimaginable battles. Each trunk was examined as if it carried destiny within it, each fiber studied so nothing would fail when the sea rose against it. Thus began the birth of a creation that had yet to be named, but already bore the weight of expectations that spanned politics, economics, and Britain's very naval identity. The shipyard bustled like a city within a city. Carpenters shouted instructions to one another. Saws screeched in a constant rhythm. Men climbed up and down makeshift structures. Overseeing this organized chaos, naval officers monitored the progress with sharp eyes. They weren't building just another warship, but a first-rate ship of the line, capable of carrying 80, perhaps even 100 cannons. A floating fortress destined to withstand enemy fire in the heart of the most brutal battles. As the skeleton of the future giant took shape, the world around it was changing rapidly. In the American colonies, tensions simmered. In Europe, empires tested borders. And on the oceans, pirates, privateers, and rival fleets contested every route, every bay, every rumor of hidden wealth. The Royal Navy needed something that represented not only strength but absolute dominance. Something that declared unmistakably, "No enemy will take the sea while we stand watch." Construction advanced without rest. Day after day, the hull's timbers were bent by fire and fitted with near artisanal precision. As the structure rose, those who watched began to realize the magnitude of the project. There was something imposing, almost alive in that silent giant emerging piece by piece. It was as if they were witnessing the birth of a creature built to rule a hostile world where only the most powerful survived. When the hull finally reached its definitive form, a sense of reverence swept over the shipyard. Even the most experienced craftsmen, men who had worked on large ships all their lives, sensed something different. This wasn't just another vessel for the King's fleet. It had presence, authority, and a strange aura of destiny. Then it received its name, HMS Victory. A bold name, almost audacious, one that carried a promise before the ship even touched water. Victory, not a wish, but a declaration. It was as if the very name challenged the future to try to deny it. As if every nail, every beam, every curve of its structure whispered, "I was born to triumph."
The naming ignited a new rhythm in the shipyard. Sailors were already being listed for future operations. High-ranking officers visited frequently, discussing routes, potential missions, expectations. News of the construction of a new first-rate ship spread through London and beyond, provoking curiosity and a mix of admiration and nervousness among both allies and rivals. But building the hull was only the beginning. The true soul of the Victory would emerge from its intricate internal engineering. Inside, it became a labyrinth of narrow corridors, cabins, storerooms, kitchens, infirmaries, workshops, And above all, 3 massive gun decks where rows of cannons would one day roar. The smell of gunpowder would eventually seep into every inch of wood, marking the ship with the unmistakable scent of the battles to come. In the months that followed, craftsmen tended to details that few would ever notice, but that could mean the difference between life and death. Gun ports were aligned millimetrically, masts raised with almost mathematical precision, ropes braided strong enough to withstand furious gales. The crew began to arrive, bringing with them the usual murmur of men destined to spend months, sometimes years, isolated from the world, trusting the ship as they trusted themselves. As the Victory gained its masts, sails, and fittings, its silhouette stood out against the horizon. With its soon-to-be iconic yellow and black paint, it projected instant authority. Some said that even when still, it seemed to advance. Yet, though immense, powerful, and majestic, the ship was still a newborn before what awaited it. Nothing in the shipyard could prepare it for the reality of open sea, where unpredictable winds snapped masts, colossal waves tested the hull, and unseen enemies plotted ambushes. Finally, after years of meticulous work, the day came to launch it into the water. A crowd gathered for the event, a swirl of expectation, pride, and superstition. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders, merchants abandoned their stalls, and officers observed solemnly, aware of the political and symbolic weight of the moment. Launching a ship of this size was not mere ceremony. It was power made visible. When the restraints were released and gravity began its work, the Victory slid slowly toward the water. The wood groaned as if breathing for the first time. And then, with an impact that echoed through the air, it touched the sea. A near-sacred silence followed. The giant floated, alive, ready. That same night, while some celebrated and others simply stared at its dark silhouette against the dim moonlight, almost no one could have imagined that this ship would one day become witness and protagonist to events that would shape human history, that it would carry heroes, face storms, defy empires, and serve as the stage for one of the greatest naval battles of all time.
But that was still far ahead. In that moment, it was simply the newest pride of the Royal Navy, awaiting its first mission. And as the wind whistled through its freshly raised masts, it seemed to whisper that what lay ahead would change everything.
As soon as the Victory touched the water, it began receiving everything that would transform it from a majestic hull into a complete organism. It was as if the ship, now breathing on the sea, waited for the moment it would discover its own identity. Experienced officers walked along the still empty decks, studying every detail, measuring spaces, assessing the future placement of cannons. Each step echoed through the wooden interiors like distant drumbeats, foreshadowing movements and battles only the future could foresee. The provisional crew assigned to prepare the ship for its first commission soon realized something both imposing and intimidating about the Victory's interior. Its long, shadowed corridors, lit by hanging lanterns, felt like deep caverns where untold stories waited to be written. The scent of fresh timber, mixed with thick tar, newly braided ropes and iron, creating a singular perfume, ritualistic almost, typical of great ships of war. On the gun decks, work intensified. Rows of cannons were installed with near-surgical precision. Each piece had its place, its metallic soul, its temperament. The clatter of wheels across the freshly polished floor sounded like the whispers of soldiers preparing for march. Even the most hardened sailors watched with a certain respect. They knew that in those tight, suffocating spaces, lives would one day be decided at mere meters from the enemy, engulfed in smoke and explosions. Meanwhile, the masts were adjusted, the sails tested, and replaced when necessary. The intricate rigging, more than 20,000 meters of rope, formed a web capable of sustaining the Victory against winds strong enough to tear weaker ships to shreds. From afar, the dense forest of ropes looked like the work of a giant spider, reinforcing the ship for the unpredictable chaos of open waters. Life aboard gradually took shape. Cooks tested makeshift stoves, surgeons organized instruments that would one day mean the difference between life and agony. Carpenters fixed every crack and alignment. Young boys, some no older than 15, scurried up and down the decks, still trying to understand how they would survive in that floating universe where discipline and courage were demanded every moment. For the British of the time, the sea wasn't merely a career, it was destiny. During this finishing period, the first stories of omens aboard the ship began to circulate. Not officially recorded, but whispered across corridors and taverns. Some swore they heard phantom footsteps at night. Others said the hull seemed to vibrate when the wind blew hard, as if anticipating battle. Superstitions were common in the naval world, and the bigger the ship, the larger the aura of myth that surrounded it. The Victory, still newborn, was already awakening imagination.
Soon the ship was ready for service, or almost. There were still political and strategic debates about its deployment. A first-rate ship wasn't sent to sea lightly. It was expensive to maintain, slow to prepare, and required a large, highly trained crew. One didn't dispatch such a floating fortress for routine missions. It needed purpose, a decisive battle, a display of power, a moment worthy of its magnitude. But destiny seemed to toy with the Victory. Instead of heading straight into glory, the ship endured years of waiting. Equipped, modified, reinforced, yet rarely sent into real action. It was as though the sea was saving it for something special, something too significant to waste on minor engagements. During this time, Europe simmered. Tensions grew. Rumors spread about France and Spain strengthening their naval alliance. Diplomatic betrayals and secret negotiations flowed through ports. And all the while, the Victory remained anchored like a slumbering colossus, receiving upgrades that slowly prepared it for greatness. This waiting was not wasted time. Officers trained the crew relentlessly. Entire teams practiced maneuvers until exhaustion, hoisting sails, rotating cannons, controlling longboats, adjusting rigging, responding to emergencies. In a world where seconds often meant the difference between life and death, every action needed to be perfect. And the ship began to develop something akin to identity, a soul forged not just from wood and iron, but from men, sweat, discipline, and dreams. Then news arrived, news that changed everything. Britain would once again face powerful continental forces. France was rumored to be preparing an invasion of the British Isles. Diplomatic storms gathered, and everyone knew the coming naval conflict would decide the course of the war. The Victory was called upon. And more than that, it would receive a commander whose presence alone inspired fear in enemies and absolute loyalty in his men. A leader who would become legend, and who would find in that ship not just a vessel, but a stage. His name? Horatio Nelson. And the moment his feet touched the deck for the first time, the aeroboard seemed to shift.
The presence of Nelson on board brought a silent yet profound transformation to the Victory. It was not merely the arrival of a commander. It was as if a new energy had passed through every beam, every rope, every shadow cast by the lanterns. The sailors, accustomed to exhausting routine and the boredom between actions, felt something different in the air: expectation, and more than that, confidence. Nelson walked across the deck with the natural ease of someone who recognizes an old friend. He observed everything carefully: the folded sails, the aligned cannons, the faces of the crew who discreetly studied him. His impeccable uniform contrasted with the rough environment, but his eyes conveyed something that immediately earned respect. He knew exactly what he was doing. There was in him a calm determination, almost paradoxical. A man small in stature, but immense in presence. The kind of leader who transformed fear into courage, doubt into purpose. And the Victory, which until then had awaited its destiny like a slumbering colossus, seemed finally to awaken. It didn't take long for Nelson to begin his meticulous inspection. He visited every deck, examined the cannons, spoke with officers, corrected details many had not even noticed. Despite the formalities, he always found a moment to motivate, to praise a sailor's effort, or to explain, simply and directly, why each task was essential. He was, above all, a strategist who understood the human value behind the sails and the gunpowder. Europe was now submerged in growing conflict. France, under Napoleon, prepared to challenge Britain's supremacy at sea. Information arrived constantly about enemy fleets moving, alliances forming, and invasion plans taking shape. Great Britain, dependent on its maritime routes, knew its survival depended on the strength of the Royal Navy. And in this scenario, Nelson and the Victory began to become central pieces. Shortly after assuming command of the Victory, Nelson initiated a series of rigorous maneuvers. Life on board gained speed. Now everything had purpose. The sails rose faster, the cannons were operated with increasing precision, and the crew learned to move like a single organism, prepared to react to any threat in seconds. The Victory's first missions under Nelson were not yet the great battles that would go down in history, but they were essential. They patrolled strategic routes, escorted convoys, monitored French and Spanish movements. The ship, finally in action, seemed to gain life with each month of navigation. The sea slammed against the hull with the strength of an adversary, testing, provoking, challenging.
Amid waves and relentless wind, the crew began to notice something curious. Nelson rarely gave unnecessary orders. He didn't create needless tension. He didn't shout. He didn't humiliate. His command came from clarity and conviction. He was the kind of leader whose example shaped the crew more than any punishment could. And this kind of leadership creates something extremely powerful: loyalty. Meanwhile, on the continent, Napoleon expanded his power with impressive speed. Defeats and victories alternated among European empires, but one thing was clear: control of the seas would become the decisive factor for the future of the war. France and Spain were already planning to unite their fleets, creating a force capable of directly threatening British dominance. And if there was something Nelson understood better than any other commander, it was the importance of anticipating the enemy. He studied reports, analyzed routes, imagined rival strategies, and prepared the crew for extreme scenarios. His mind was restless, always a few steps ahead. During one of the patrols, while the Victory cut through the cold waters of the Atlantic, a particularly strong wind battered the ship. Waves rose violently against the hull, and the crew struggled to keep everything under control. The sea seemed to test not only the vessel, but the resolve of those aboard. The sails cracked loudly, ropes tightened to the brink of snapping, and every movement demanded strength and precision. Nelson remained on deck throughout the storm, his clothes drenched in salty wind, his hair plastered to his face, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. At no moment did he waver, and his presence there, in the heart of the storm, was enough to keep every man on the ship standing, clinging to the task before him. When the storm finally eased, many sailors whispered that they had never seen a commander like him. It was after this storm that alarming news began to arrive. The French and Spanish fleets were gathering.
powerful warships, numerous and prepared to break the British blockade and secure supremacy in the Atlantic. And the Admiralty sent clear orders to Nelson: intercept the enemy alliance before it could fully reorganize, prevent its naval power from becoming overwhelming, and, if necessary, confront it directly. The Victory, now fully integrated with its commander's spirit, set southward with fierce determination. The wind filled the sails as if sharing human urgency. The sea seemed to open a path towards something grand or terrible. As the ship advanced, Nelson gathered his officers. Inside, illuminated only by the trembling glow of lamplight, maps were spread across the table. Shadows cast by the flickering flame gave the meeting an almost ritualistic atmosphere. It was there, in that moment, that the strategy began to be born. The strategy that would change naval history forever. Outside, the crew worked in silence, aware that something immense was approaching. There was no explicit fear, but a deep kind of anxiety, the kind that precedes moments that define destinies. The Victory advanced toward the encounter that would transform its name into legend.
The horizon seemed like a blurred blade between sky and sea as the Victory advanced southward, driven by insistent winds that blew like omens of change. With each passing day, the ocean assumed a different character, at times calm and dark blue, at times turbulent and gray, as if nature itself sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. And at the center of that unpredictable vastness, the ship that carried the fate of the Royal Navy pressed forward with almost human determination. Nelson walked the deck with firm yet discreet steps. He seemed to feel in every vibration of the hull the urgency of the moment. The Admiral knew that the coming battle would not simply be a contest between ships, but between ideas, strategies, and possible futures. His mind worked tirelessly, like a living map, tracing scenarios, anticipating maneuvers, imagining responses to every enemy movement. Meanwhile, the crew followed a rigorous, almost ritualistic routine. Life aboard a warship was not made only of heroism and glory. It was made of discipline, sweat, and repetition. Cannons were cleaned daily, sails inspected, ropes reinforced. The smallest oversight could prove costly amid the chaos of battle. And by then, every man aboard knew he was about to face something he would never forget. At dawn one morning, as the sun rose in cabin, the room, traditionally used for formal dinners and diplomatic meetings, now exhaled an atmosphere of strategy and tension. Spread across the large wooden table were detailed maps of the Spanish coast, ocean currents, wind forecasts, and recent reports on the enemy fleet. The officers sat in silence, awaiting the Admiral's words. Nelson, with an intense gaze and upright posture, took a deep breath before beginning. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice grave and steady, "we are about to face one of the largest fleets ever assembled in modern times. France and Spain believe that by joining forces they can break our blockade and ensure supremacy at sea. But we will not allow that, not while we have a ship like the Victory and men like you."
Then Nelson presented his strategy. Many expected him to adopt a conventional formation, as had been tradition for countless generations. But Nelson didn't believe traditions alone could win modern wars. He believed in boldness, and he showed it clearly. "We will break their line," he declared. "We will not attack parallel to them, as is common. We will advance in vertical columns. Yes, we will take the initial fire, but the disorder we cause in their formation will give us a decisive advantage." There were murmurs among those present, but no open disagreements. Everyone knew Nelson was an exceptional strategist, capable of seeing beyond established patterns. And they also knew the plan was risky, perhaps the riskiest they had ever faced. But it was precisely that risk that could guarantee victory. After the meeting, the officers returned to their posts and relayed the instructions to the crew. There was no panic, only a silent, almost tangible tension. It was as if each man were facing his own version of the reality approaching them, a reality made of gunpowder, smoke, and uncertainty. As the days passed, routine intensified. Sailors practiced essential maneuvers over and over, loading cannons, positioning them according to the wind, moving around the deck amid imaginary explosions, extinguishing fires, tending the wounded. Each task was executed hundreds of times until it became automatic. On the lower decks, carpenters reinforced structures, adjusted beams, and checked every inch of the hull. Above them, the sailmasters tested, cut, and stitched canvas with almost religious precision. One late afternoon, as the sky painted itself in golden and orange tones, Nelson climbed to the main deck and stared at the horizon for a long time. He seemed to reflect on everything he had lived until that moment: victories, defeats, physical and emotional scars, the responsibility of leading men in defining moments. Beside him was Captain Hardy, his longtime friend, trusted man, and inseparable partner. "Hardy," Nelson began, his eyes still fixed on the sea, "have you ever noticed how a man's life seems to boil down to just a few moments? Moments when everything we've been, everything we've done, culminates in a single instant." Hardy remained silent for a few seconds before responding. "Yes, sir, and I believe we're about to live one of those moments." Nelson smiled faintly, as someone who recognizes a truth he already knew but needed to hear aloud. "When the battle begins, I want you to remember that we are not fighting only for victories, but for what our presence at sea represents. England depends on it. Our people depend on it." Hardy nodded, resolute. That night, an unusual calm settled over the sea. The Victory sailed gently, cutting through almost silent waters, while the full moon illuminated the ship with a silver glow. Some sailors used the brief respite to write letters that might never reach their destination. Others gazed at the sky, searching for strength in memories of home. Some whispered prayers. Others tried to sleep despite their anxiety, and some simply sat on deck, watching the moon's reflection on the waves as if searching for answers. Nelson, however, did not sleep. He spent the night mentally reviewing every stage of the strategy, every possible enemy reaction, every strength and weakness of the opposing fleet. It was as if his mind were already at war before the first shot was fired. At dawn, when the sun was still emerging faintly, a cry sounded from the lookout mast. "Sails to the south! Sails on the horizon!" In seconds, the calm shattered. The deck filled with movement. Officers rushed to observe the formation slowly emerging in the distance. The sea seemed to swell in significance, as if the waves themselves were clearing a path for something immense. Nelson hurried to the upper deck. Hardy joined him. Together, they watched the horizon where dozens of white points multiplied against the distant blue. "They're here," Hardy murmured. "Yes," Nelson replied, "and they've come in great number." The enemy fleet, French and Spanish ships, advanced with power and a certain confidence. It was one of the largest naval formations ever seen. But as the sails grew closer, the Victory did not retreat. On the contrary,
It adjusted its course, advancing firmly, as though it had been waiting for this moment since the day it first touched the sea. Nelson drew in a long breath, absorbing the weight of the moment. "Prepare the signal," he ordered. Minutes later, the Victory hoisted one of the most famous messages in naval history. "England expects that every man will do his duty." When the crew saw the message flying in the wind, they erupted in shouts of affirmation, as if the words themselves strengthened them. The phrase, simple and powerful, seemed to ignite the spirit of all aboard. Duty overcame fear, turned hesitation into courage, doubt into purpose. The distance between the two fleets narrowed. The sea, now brightened by the rising sun, seemed to tremble under the weight of the coming clash. The enemy ships moved like colossal shadows, their masts towering like the skyline of a floating city. And the Victory, leading the British fleet, advanced like a solitary lion, fully aware of its strength and its destiny. Nelson knew the opening of the battle would be brutal. Breaking the enemy line required exposing the ship to the first volleys. But that was the beauty and the risk of his strategy, to control chaos by turning initial confusion into decisive advantage. The wind shifted, sails were adjusted, cannons positioned. The crew gathered at their stations. The tension was so intense it felt like the air itself vibrated.
Then a boom split the silence. The first enemy cannon had fired. The shot fell short, but its roar resonated like a declaration. The battle had begun. The Victory pressed forward. Smoke from enemy cannon fire thickened in the air, forming a gray veil. Shouts of command echoed across the decks. Ropes strained, sails shuddered violently. As the British ship approached the enemy line, the rain of projectiles intensified. Cannonballs slammed into the water, sending geysers of foam skyward. Some ricocheted off the hull, others tore into the wooden frame, shaking planks and souls alike. But the Victory did not slow. It moved as if nothing could divert it, as if an invisible force propelled it directly into the heart of the enemy fleet. Nelson remained on deck, observing every movement. His eyes, despite the danger, radiated an almost supernatural calm. It was as though he saw beyond the smoke, beyond the chaos, beyond war itself. Finally, the Victory opened fire. The roar of British cannons shook the ship from bow to stern. Thick, suffocating white smoke spread instantly. Men clamped their hands over their ears, felt the deck tremble, shouted orders they could barely hear. Cannons recoiled violently, needing to be repositioned after each shot. The nearest enemy ship was struck with devastating force. Planks splintered, masts tilted, men were thrown into the air. It was only the beginning. The Victory drove straight through the enemy line as planned, slicing the formation in two. Confusion erupted among the Franco-Spanish fleet. French ships scrambled to adjust their course. Spanish ships fired blindly. Chaos spread, exactly as Nelson had foreseen. But amid the frenzy, the Victory also suffered. Enemy cannonballs crashed into the hull, shattered structures, snapped ropes. The wounded were carried below deck, where surgeons fought desperately to save lives with crude tools and trembling hands. At the height of the battle, as he observed the fight from the quarterdeck, Nelson was struck.
A bullet fired from a French ship tore through the upper deck and hit him in the shoulder, piercing his body.
He fell. Hardy rushed to him, panic rising as men around them shouted for help, but Nelson, despite the searing pain, tried to remain conscious. "The battle," he whispered. "Go on. The victory is certain." He was taken below deck, where the surgeon attempted to stop the bleeding, but the admiral knew it was too late. His body weakened even as his spirit remained unbroken. Meanwhile, above him, the Victory fought with renewed fury. Every man seemed to fight with the strength of two. It was as though Nelson's fall had ignited an even greater determination to win. When the smoke finally began to lift and the thunder of cannon slowed, it became clear the enemy fleet had been defeated. French and Spanish ships were destroyed, scattered, or surrendered. Their line had been irreparably broken. The battle was won. Hours later, Hardy descended to the lower deck, where Nelson lay fading. Holding back tears, he approached the admiral. "The victory is ours, sir," he said. Nelson, with one final effort, smiled. "Thank God. I have done my duty," he murmured. And then his breathing ceased. The Victory, scarred but glorious, sailed slowly through a sea stained with smoke and debris. The battle that had ended there would forever mark its name and that of its commander in history. The ship had fulfilled its destiny. And somehow the wood seemed to breathe once more, as if acknowledging that it had just witnessed the birth of a legend.
The sea still carried in the air the bitter smell of gunpowder as the Victory left the battlefield behind, advancing slowly like an exhausted warrior, covered in scars yet standing firm. The calm waters felt like an irony compared to the storm of fire that had consumed the world only hours earlier. Fragments of wood, torn sails, and pieces of masts from enemy ships floated like silent ghosts, wordless witnesses to the ferocity that had overtaken the ocean. The crew of the Victory walked across the deck with heavy steps. Some limped, others carried the wounded, and others still stood motionless, staring at the horizon as if trying to understand what they had just lived through. The victory was clear and decisive, but it had come at a cost. The marks on their faces, their hands, and their uniforms spoke of courage and loss. Inside the ship, where darkness was broken only by lanterns swaying with the rhythm of the waves, Nelson's body rested covered by a flag. A profound silence surrounded him, the kind that exists only when death passes too close to something grand. Crew members approached one by one, removing their hats, touching the fabric with their fingertips, whispering quiet farewells. There were no outbursts, no loud cries. Their respect manifested in sobriety. Captain Hardy remained close by, motionless, with a look that blended mourning, exhaustion, and responsibility. He knew that even without his commander, there was still much to do. The battle was over, but the war was not. The ship needed to be taken home, needed to tell the world what had happened, and needed to preserve Nelson's memory, which now grew larger than life. Meanwhile, on the main deck, men swept away the debris of battle, blood, splinters, pieces of burned rope. The Victory was wounded but alive. The hull carried dozens of holes, some so deep they revealed internal layers of wood. The sails displayed enormous tears as if giants had tried to rip them apart. And still the ship stood firm. Engineers and carpenters immediately began emergency repairs. They used improvised wood to patch critical holes, reinforced rigging, and replaced damaged pulleys. It was incessant, almost surgical work.
Each hammer strike echoed like a reminder that, despite the glory, the ship still needed to survive the sea in order for its story to be told. In the days that followed, as the Victory slowly sailed back to England, the crew began to feel Nelson's absence more deeply. Before, he walked among them, motivated them, inspired them, noticed every detail. Now his presence was felt as a void, but also as a force. During the nights, many sailors told stories about the Admiral, stories that mixed facts and legends, exaggerations and truths. They spoke of bravery, impossible decisions, unshakable courage. That was how heroes became myths. When alive, they led. When dead, they transcended.
Hardy, though devastated, made a point of repeatedly saying that Nelson's greatest wish had been fulfilled. England remained sovereign at sea. The trade routes were protected. Napoleon's invasion plans were in ruins. The victory was not only military, it was strategic, symbolic, historic. When they finally spotted the British coastline, a collective sigh swept across the deck of the Victory. The sight of home brought a strange comfort, a mixture of relief and melancholy. The local population already knew, through rumors and messages sent by faster ships, that a great battle had taken place and that Nelson was dead. But the magnitude of the victory was still unknown. As the Victory approached the harbor, crowds gathered. Shouts, flags, people running to see the ship returning triumphant and battered. Many expected to see Nelson waving from the deck, as he had done so many times before. But when they realized that Captain Hardy was alone, silence spread like a wave. The ship entered the harbor carrying not only its physical weight, but the weight of an era that had changed. The Battle of Trafalgar would become the turning point that defined British supremacy for more than a century, and the Victory would forever be remembered as the stage upon which that transformation unfolded. The ceremonies that followed were marked by honor and mourning. Nelson's body was removed from the ship amid applause, tears, and absolute reverence. Hardy accompanied the entire process with firm posture, even with his heart pierced by grief. Crew members lined up along the deck while bells tolled. It was the end of a cycle, but also the beginning of immortality. Without Nelson, the Victory underwent extensive repairs. But even among the new reinforcements and replacements, the ship never lost the scars of battle. They remained like historical tattoos, like war marks that silently told the epic it had lived. As time advanced, the ship continued to serve, though never in the same way. It would still sail, still be used in operations and demonstrations, but its primary role was no longer merely military. It had become symbolic. It was a living monument, a floating reminder of the strength, strategy, and courage that had shaped the destiny of an empire. Decades passed. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. New technologies transformed naval warfare. But the Victory remained. Its decks, which had once seen enemy fire, now welcomed scholars, curious visitors, and dignitaries. Some came to honor Nelson. Others came to understand the ship's engineering. Others came simply to feel history alive in every piece of wood, every rope, every shadow.
There were moments when the ship was almost lost. Storms, neglect, decay. The wood rotted in some parts, the masts weakened. More modern ships appeared, and the Victory seemed like a relic from another era. But the British people, deeply connected to Nelson's legacy and the memory of Trafalgar, did not allow it to disappear. Restorations began, reconstructions, preservations. It was work that lasted decades and continues even today. The ship that had once been born for war was now reborn for history. And as time passed, its presence grew more powerful. Visitors walked through its narrow corridors, touched its ancient beams, listened to the stories whispered by guides. And many said they could feel something in the air, as if the soul of the ship were still there, watching, remembering, living. And perhaps it was. For ships like the Victory are not merely wood and metal. They are witnesses of eras, guardians of memory, monuments of courage. Their decks are stages for stories that continued to resonate centuries later. And their existence reminds us that some moments and some lives transcend time. The Victory, now permanently anchored in Portsmouth, still rises against the British sky like a proud giant. Its sails no longer open to the wind, but its presence continues to dominate the space around it. It no longer sails the sea, it sails memory. And as tourists, historians, and veteran sailors walk across its decks, it is impossible not to imagine the echoes of the past. The roar of cannons, the smell of gunpowder, the shouts of command, the roar of the sea, and above all, Nelson's voice telling Captain Hardy that he had done his duty. Today, the Victory is more than a ship. It is a living story, a symbol of resilience, a monument to courage, a permanent tribute to those who faced the impossible and won. And so it remains, silent, immense, eternal.